Hi, and welcome to the first Ask the Experts webinar of 2022. I am Dr. Pam Hurstella Pietra, President and founder of Children and Screens, Institute of Digital Media and Child Development, and host of our popular Ask the Experts webinar series. We are so glad that you joined us today. We took the occasion of our 40th webinar to host a much anticipated multidisciplinary examination of the enormous ways that the internet, digital media, video games, and social media have influenced our society. Indeed, technology is shaping everything from the global economy to our attention spans, but we don't often recognize the insidious consequences or beneficial interconnections. Today, we have assembled a fascinating team consisting of a public health expert, a Pulitzer-prize nominated journalist, an education researcher, a sociologist, a psychologist, a policymaker, a privacy and security specialist, and experts on families and others to discuss this very question. Naturally, one webinar hardly scratches the surface, nor can it drill down on any one aspect of technology or fully explicate the nuances of this complicated new ecosystem in the way that our other webinars focused on one topic. This webinar is just a taste of all the great information we're compiling for a new section of our website that will delve deeper than we can in 90 minutes, so stay tuned for more. Our panelists have reviewed the questions that you have submitted and will answer as many as they can during the time today. If you have additional questions during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to answer at every question. We're recording today's workshop and we'll upload a video to YouTube in the coming days. All registrants will receive a link to our YouTube channel where you can watch our past 39 webinars while you wait for this video to be posted. It is now my big pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Primack, our moderator for today's webinar. Dr. Primack is the Dean of the College of Education and Health Professions at the University of Arkansas, where he also serves as the Henry G. Hotz Endowed Chair in Educational Innovations and Professor of Public Health and Medicine. He was also the founding director at the University of Pittsburgh's Multidisciplinary Center for Research on Media, Technology, and Health, and is the recent recipient of multiple regional, national, and international awards for research, teaching, and overall achievement. We're so excited to have Dr. Primack with us to lead this important conversation today. Welcome, Brian.
Great, thank you very much, Pam. And I very much appreciate being invited. This is a really exciting group of people, and you can't get bigger than a broad view of technology and how it affects society. So let's go ahead and jump in. What I would like to do is start off by just talking a little bit about technology and its impact on health. Even that could fill several volumes. Now, we don't have that much time with so many experts, but what I would say is that if you had to sort of coalesce it into just a couple of tidbits, the biggest one with regard to technology and health is that we in public health think that technology is pretty much the sharpest double-edged sword of our era. There are positive things that come from this edge of the sword, and there are negative things that come from this edge of the sword. And we kind of need to study both so that ultimately we can learn to dull the edge that's causing more problems and sharpen the edge that is somehow helping us. So if you just take one example, probably what you hear about most in the media is the research that's been done about technology use, say social media use, and mental health. In particular, there are a number of studies that are now longitudinal and lab-based, et cetera, that have connected using a lot of social media and certain other digital medias with depression, with social isolation, with anxiety. These are things that were brought very much into the public eye just a month or two ago when an individual made public certain documents that Facebook and Instagram were aware of these mental health challenges that young people using their platforms were dealing with. However, back to the double-edged sword, there is another edge to that, which is that we also know that things like social media can catalyze connection. They can, we've had experiences with warmth and generosity that we have experienced through social media and digital media. Many of us were able to do things during the time of COVID-19 to alleviate isolation. So both of these things are very much true. And with regard to mental health, it's not a clear path forward. This is exactly why it's going to be so exciting to hear from so many people today. I'll just give a couple of other quick examples before moving on to the main event. What about physical health? Well, one of the biggest things that we've seen a lot of research on is technology, say screen time, and associations with obesity, diabetes, sleep problems. So you can imagine how this plays out. If you're using all of a sudden hours and hours of screen time, all of a sudden you're gonna not be as active. We've also found through research that there are other reasons why it becomes a perfect storm. People during screen time are very stimulated by certain advertisements and things like that, and tend to overeat and overeat the wrong kinds of things during their screen time. They're also affected by advertising that can lead to poor choices, even while they're not actually in front of some type of media, whether that be a video game or whether that be social media. So all of these things lead to the potential associations that we've seen between technology use and things like obesity, diabetes, sleep problems. However, there are also now, again, looking at the other side of this the double-edged sword, there are apps that help us with diet and exercise choices. There are so many different ways that right now I can download an app and get ripped, or start using, yoga as a daily practice, or meditate, things that are valuable for physical health in so many different ways that we can't just sort of discount those things. So again, we've got this double-edged sword where we need to understand both edges, and then we need to figure out the best way to respond. And the last thing that I'll say about this is that there is a lot of question about health and information. Obviously, there's a lot of good information that people can now just get to immediately on the web in various ways with digital media. Before, you might have had to go to a library and request a volume, and you wouldn't even necessarily be able to get the information you were looking for. Now we can do that very, very quickly. So there's a lot of good health information out there, but there is a lot of misinformation as well, which represents that other side of the double-edged sword. And we're very aware of that. We're going to be hearing a lot about that today. And so a lot of times people consider the misinformation even more dangerous than the good information. For example, there have been studies that demonstrate that misinformation can actually travel more quickly. So these are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about. So just like when it comes to other things that are a double-edged sword, like food, we always learn that obviously food can be nourishing and it can be wonderful, but then there was a long period of time where we learned that too many carbs was bad, and too many fats was bad, and too many of this kind of fat was really bad. Look, we realized the answer is not to stop eating. It's that we needed a food pyramid. We needed guidelines. And the same, I think, is true for social media, digital technology, and the other things we're going to be talking about today. So Children and Screens is here to get all this information out there, and then we can start to craft that pyramid. We can start to figure out what is that set of guidelines that can help us create a nourishing tech diet while also reducing the potential challenges. With that, I would like to introduce our first panelist, and I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Carrie James. She is a principal investigator at Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I'm particularly excited to welcome her because I am a graduate of the Harvard Graduate School of Education way back in 1993. She is a sociologist by training, and she leads research and education that is focused on young people's experiences in digital life, obviously very, very applicable to what we're talking about today. And this, what specific things does she look at? It focuses on all kinds of things like ethical dilemmas, civic participation, and strategies to support all kinds of well-being. So with that, it is great to have you here, Dr. James.
Thanks so much, Brian. I really appreciate that introduction, and thanks to you, Pam, as well. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. I so appreciate the impulse to kind of pull back and look at the big picture. And so, so my work feels really connected to that motive. I'll say at the outset that the work I'm going to pull from in my brief presentation today is carried out in close partnership with Emily Weinstein, who's at the Ed School at Harvard with me. She's an expert in adolescent development. And really documenting the textured ins and outs of adolescents' experiences in digital life is core to our work. How digital media has intersected with youth civic participation is a topic that we've been tracking for a decade now. And so I'm going to share some insights past and present from this work we've done. Early on, we heard a lot about slacktivism. And this is not to be confused with the digital collaboration tool, but that is very popular today. I use it myself, but this was the label given not long ago to social media posts that were allegedly more about making the poster feel like they were doing something than actually doing something. And fortunately, from my perspective, the conversation has mostly shifted away from sweeping generalizations like this toward a much more nuanced discussion of where, when, and how social media posts can have impact. And I think that's a good thing. But at a high level, just like Brian shared with health, I think we can tell a pretty enduring double-edged sword story when we think about how the digital and the civic interact. There are clear positives like the ability to circulate civic content to a mass audience, scalability. There are also vexing challenges like unproductive or even toxic discourse. So this sort of opportunities and risks narrative is probably not breaking news to anyone listening today, but the particulars of adolescents' experiences with the digital civic landscape are super interesting. So I'm excited to share some nuggets that we've learned. So 10 years ago, when we first started doing this work and interviewed civic youth, we heard a lot of enthusiasm about how social media could amplify their civic agendas. But we also heard a lot of wonders and worries as well. So they fretted about getting sucked into conflict. They worried about having a lingering digital footprint that was politicized in ways that could be problematic for them down the road in their futures. At the time, some of the youth that we interviewed actually decided, and we followed them a little bit over time, they decided that the risks of civic posting on social media were greater than the rewards. And they opted to go quiet on social media about civic issues, even as they continued to be civically active in their schools and communities. So in sum, back then, there were upsides and challenges that young people experienced, but opting out felt possible, and many did. So fast forward to today, and social media continues to be a very powerful civic venue, but also a challenging one. But two key differences we've heard from teens in our latest round of research in the past couple of years. Number one is that staying silent about civic matters on social media is far more difficult for them. And number two, this pain point is not limited to civically active youth. Regardless of their civic inclinations or activities, teens tell us that they feel subtle and not so subtle pressures to be civic online. And how all this plays out is certainly shaped by their identities, the context they live in, the apps they use, the specific civic topic. Yet the idea that social media creates civic pressures and a sense that there are countless ways to get it wrong is a through line theme in our work. So let me share a couple of examples. I think perspectives on Black Lives Matter from teens in our research are really telling. After the murder of George Floyd, Alana, a leader in her high school's Black student union, spent countless hours organizing protests. She felt a distinct pressure to post her thoughts on social media too, which really frustrated her because many of the BLM posts that seemed to be flooding her Instagram feed felt not so helpful or even disingenuous. She didn't want to post, but others seemed to expect it. Another teen, Nana, observed much more confrontational dynamics. She said people will, quote, break friendships over not using their platform to post about BLM. In her peer group, social media silence meant you were taking sides and friendships were literally on the line. Again, these dynamics are experienced differently by teens based on their identities. Teens of color, who I just shared perspectives from, shared a specific kind of dynamic, and white teens felt other pressures. But a common theme is that peer pressures made some level of online civic posting feel mandatory, even for teens not involved in civic issues. And this pressure stokes further dilemmas. We heard teens continually puzzling over how to share their perspectives in authentic versus performative ways on social media. It's also amplified by a larger cancel culture that makes online slip-ups actually scandalous. So one teen told us about a full-blown scandal that erupted in her high school when a teen posted a selfie on the beach the day after George Floyd was killed. The teen's close friends replied right away with typical over-the-top praise for her bikini, but the blowback from a wider peer group was harsh, especially about the timing of what appeared to be a self-centered and frivolous post. So these stories from today's teens really highlight dynamics that feel qualitatively different from what we heard in the past. So to wrap up, I think I'd like to say that it's fair to say that the scene has shifted over the last decade or more. The simplistic narrative that posting on Facebook or Twitter amounts to slacktivism appears to have given way to the reality that social media is a necessary part of civic life. We can all readily recognize that the civic sphere now has an unavoidable digital or social media dimension, but the inverse is also true, especially for teens. Their digital circles have become more and more unavoidably civic. And there are clear opportunities here, back to that double-edged sword, clear opportunities for civic development that teens give voice to as well. But the unique tensions and challenges warrant adult attention too. So I'll close there, excited for the conversation, and thanks for the opportunity to share these insights.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. James. This is exactly the thing about qualitative research, that it gives you those deeper nuances, and I think it's important for us to realize just how complex it is. That it's not just a question of I'm going to use social media to become more civic. All of a sudden, there are all kinds of rules. There are all kinds of challenges that people might be facing. And we need to be very aware of that so that we can help them, perform that civic engagement in as empowered as a way as possible. So with that, I'd like to move on to our next guest, who is actually going to be joining us digitally. So here's one of the positive things about digital technology. And it truly is a pleasure to introduce digitally Jamie Raskin. I actually feel a little bit starstruck because he is the representative for Maryland's 8th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. And that happens to be where I grew up. So the representative when I was growing up was Michael Barnes. But I know from my friends who still live there that Congressman Raskin is an absolute legend and just loved in the area. Before Congress, he was a 3-term state senator in Maryland. He's also a professor of constitutional law at American University's Washington College of Law, and he did that for more than 25 years. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at Congressman Raskin's speech.
Hi, everybody. It's Congressman Jamie Raskin from Maryland's beautiful 8th Congressional District. I wanted to say hello to all my friends at Children and Screens, and thank you for conducting this very important session on the media's influence in American democracy today, elections, disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, conspiracy theory, and so on. The subject is obviously of central and urgent importance to the future of American democratic institutions. On the January 6th Select Committee and in the impeachment trial that we had in the Senate, we saw the way in which the internet was used, the social media companies were used to immediately spread propaganda and lies about the 2020 election, to spread conspiracy theories about the election being stolen and about election fraud taking place. In fact, more than 60 different federal and state courts rejected every claim of electoral fraud and every claim of electoral corruption. But, you know, as Mark Twain said, the truth can barely get its shoes on in the time that a lie can get halfway around the world. And that was before the internet. And with the internet, these terrible lies and this kind of propaganda has incredible staying power. The internet was also used as an organizing tool, a mechanism for people coordinating their movements. And we know that there's already been indictments for seditious conspiracy against one group, the Oath Keepers, but there were multiple domestic violent extremist groups that were using different kinds of social media and apps in order to communicate their movements, their planning, and their financing, and so on. And so it's not just the Oath Keepers, it's the Proud Boys, it's the Three Percenters, it's the QAnon networks, it's the militia groups, it's the First Amendment Praetorian, and on and on and on. So we have to look very seriously about the impact that technology has had, the corrosive impact that technology has had on democratic political institutions and indeed on the survival of democracy. At the same time, we know that the internet and social media can be used in positive ways in order to promote real social and political dialogue and nonviolent political organizing and the promotion of truth. So we've got to figure out how we got ourselves into this jam and how we're going to get ourselves out of it. And that's with respect to the whole society. We have a specific problem relating to social media and young people. And we want to look at what kind of influences the internet and the new technologies are having on children, on the formation of their cognition, on the formation of their understanding of politics, of relationships, of social life. What effect has it had on the literacy of children? So all of those things need to be looked at, and not with any kind of predetermined polemical conclusions, but in a fair-minded way. I've got legislation called the CAMERA Act, which is bipartisan legislation that will fund important research out at NIH on just this question. What have been the mental, social, physical, emotional, educational, health consequences of the internet and social media on the new generation? Positive, negative, and in between, so we can get a complete understanding of it, and then we can know how to take action on it. Every new technology has introduced its own problems and its own potential, its own possibilities for positive change in society, and also its destructive potential implications as well. So we just have to be attuned to them. We got to analyze them as they're happening, because the democracy has got to come first. It's we the people, it's the governance of the people, and it's the success and flourishing of everybody in our society that counts. And the technology has got to be a tool for us to live in the healthiest possible society we can. So thank you for what you're doing. I'm eager to check out the conclusions and the findings and all the deliberations of this discussion. And thanks for giving me a moment just to say these words, and I will yield back to you.
Great. Well, I think that was a super and exactly what I would expect from Congressman Raskin. I always appreciate Mark Twain's insights, and that idea that he mentioned about untruths being able to propagate easier than truths has actually been demonstrated in research. So Mark Twain was, as we always know, ahead of his time. Okay, so now I would like to introduce Don Grant. So Dr. Grant is in the right place to be talking about media and technology. He is the president of the American Psychological Association Division 46, which is the Society for Media Psychology and Technology. He's also the chair of both APA's Device Management and Intelligence area, as well as strategic planning. And he also has clinical experience because he's the executive director of outpatient services for Newport Healthcare. So here to give us a few words is Dr. Don Grant.
Thank you so much, Brian. And I want to thank Dr. Pam and everyone on this panel. I am so honored to be here, and thank all of you who are watching, because your interest allows me to continue my investigations and my work. All right, so I'm going to share something, and hopefully you can see that. Are we good, Brian? Okay, so what I want to say, a couple of things in the top. I am not anti-technology. I'm all about it. I use it, even though I'm a digital immigrant. And what my colleagues have said previously is that, of course, it is good, and it's also here. So I am a media psychologist. I'm also my specialization is addiction. So I kind of parlay those two things together. And when I look at, we're talking about the double-edged sword, whenever I look at anything that might be unhealthy, I look at it in the following way. I look at, is in any way it negatively impacting, in this order, biological, psychological, sociological, career or academic, and then environmental. And if anywhere in any of those silos, any behavior is impacting in a negative way, then it might be something you want to look at. So I teach and investigate healthy device management and the practice of good digital citizenship. So what I'm about to show you is an article that feels like I wrote it so long ago, but it was in 2015 and published in 2016. And please excuse me again, I'm a media psychologist who works with addictive behaviors. So I started to look at the way we relate, our relation with devices, and I just kind of commented. So I'm just going to show you something that I came up with as I was thinking about it. All right, so I live in Los Angeles, so your consideration is something that we're seeing a lot of now, and it's about media. But I want to show you some things, and just for your consideration. So addicts keep their drug close, usually on their person or in a carry bag. Addicts prefer to be alone with their drug, perseverate on it, and can't wait to be with it, even when engaged with other activities. Although fully aware of its placement, they compulsively pack pockets, check bags to ensure they want to know where that is. If misplaced, their anxiety escalates until their drug is successfully recovered. If accidentally left behind, the addict will return to retrieve the drug, even at the risk of being late. I mean, you kind of see maybe where I'm going here. Ensuring their drug remains perpetually accessible is priority number one, even when doing other things. Addicts lie about their use, especially if challenged. Addicts overextend their finances in favor of maintaining and improving their user experience. Relationships, responsibilities, academics, careers, families become supplanted or secondary. And then a little dopamine squirt rush comes from using, or even the anticipation of using. Attempts to control or cut back prove unsuccessful usually. Lack of ability to use generates restlessness, irritability, and discontent. Attempts to sneak use, even against better judgment or pleas from others. No, please. When they're stashed, and for devices, I kind of gave you a clue of, you kind of see what I'm doing here. It would be battery life, connectivity, begin to run low. The addict becomes very anxious until they can get their supply back. And overuse or misuse is often followed by guilt, shame, decreased self-esteem, especially after a session of doom scrolling or stalking. And then a hashtag for real promise. I'm not going to do it the next time. So obviously, I'm talking about drugs, but if you look at your device use, and any of these can be applied, this is what I work with my clients. I say, yeah, you know, it kind of makes sense. And we can't call it addiction to devices, not yet. The rest of the world kind of has a different outlook, but I have to be clear and, you know, that we are not calling it addiction yet, because I am, you know, very involved with the American Psychological Association, and we haven't got there. We're hoping, and there's some things and conditions for further study for the next DSM, but neither the APA or the American Psychiatric Association has gotten there yet. We'll see. All right. So when they do it, the attempt invariably fails. All right. So moving on. Obviously, Dr. Twenji, she's done comprehensive research. So here's when we're talking about the psychological well-being of adolescents around the world began to decline in 2012 in conjunction with the rise of the smartphone access and increased internet use. Causation cannot be proven. That's why we do research. This is why it's so great about the Dr. Pam and the Institute and all of my colleagues and everyone who does research. We need the research. This is a very nascent behavior. Even though it feels like to the kids, this is all they knew, but we just need to keep looking, and that's important. All right, so what we do know, and this is, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I have colleagues who also are going to speak about this, I think, a little bit. So youth mental health is worsening, and as I'm sharing my screen, you can see, you know, what's underneath it, but we know this. The research is already coming out. They've done studies in 2012, in October of 2017, the data came out again, and then in 2019, we're seeing this. Young people, and I work with them every day, and I've worked with them for 2 decades, they're struggling. Now, is it because of devices? We don't know. There could be a lot of variables, but I think that the impact of devices as a variable cannot be discounted. And so the rates of suicide ideation are highest among youth, especially amongst the LGBTQ+ youth. Even before COVID, the prevalence of mental health and mental illness, among adults was increasing. 13.84% of youth report suffering from at least one major depressive episode in the past year, and childhood depression is more likely to persist into adulthood if gone untreated. Now, again, can this be correlated with devices? We're not sure. We can have ideas and hypotheses. This is why we do the work, but these are the real facts. And what was interesting is that for children, anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide, and one, of course, is too many, it was stabilized for decades. And then we started seeing this increase that we couldn't really understand and started looking at in 2010 and 2012. All right, so just have to say it. I work with kids, I listen to them all the time. So one of the things that they talk about is going into social media and being on their platforms, and they are comparing themselves to others. And so that's a lot of what my work is, a lot of what I talk to the kids, doing reality versus perception, authentic online presence. We do a lot of that work. And the statistics are clear. Depression, yeah, exactly. So the pediatric psychiatric ER visits increasing. ER visits by children with mental health disorders, and these are the kids. So they're going to the ER. So we have to look at these. And of course, as researchers, we want to know why. Suicidal ideation attempts among children increased. And then, of course, because this is my wheelhouse, adolescent substance abuse, reported adolescent substance use declined by an average of 8.3 percentage points in the decade between 2011 and 2021. This is actually good news. But I also, for my work, I want to know why. Pediatric ER visits for substance use disorder, however, rose. The drug overdose deaths, I think that there's a lot of things, if you've seen or been following the news, we know this is going on. This is a whole other presentation, but it's increased. This is just not okay, of course. All right, so some of the negative. Disruptive non-restorative sleep, poor sleep hygiene. These are some of the things of device use that I have actually seen in my practice and when I work with kids in my outpatient. Attention span issues, isolation and loneliness, sudden unexpected poor school performance, unexplained loss of interest or resistance in re-engaging. and previously enjoyed hobbies, sports, talents, ECs, goals, friends. Of course, because of what the kids experienced, and a lot of us who worked from home over the last couple of years, this is a variable that we have to take into account, but it was happening before the pandemic. Unhistorical anger and outbursts, problems focusing, anxiety and depression, stress, unhealthy weight change and hygiene, vulnerability to dangerous situations, and missing and rejecting organic fits for connections. This one's important because my first research study was an investigation of online versus face-to-face support. And just for my work, connection in real life is the nemesis of addiction. So the idea of reemerging and reengaging, this we know. Now, again, this is fantastic that we have these online connections. We just got to see Congressman Raskin. We can all be here together right now and do this wonderful work together, and you can watch it. So there are good things, but I'm really about the valence, the value, and the vitality of in real life connection, because I know, and I have proven in my own research, that this is, again, the antidote to any kind of addiction or substance or dependency. So it's very important. And a lot of the work I'm doing now is really encouraging the kids and adults to get back out there and get engaged. And so when we're talking about use, these are just things I came up with because I always like to give solutions. So these are just some suggestions of when you or someone you care about, or you're an educator or a clinician, here's the things you can ask about your device use. Why are you or they engaging? What are you or they doing on the device? Where are you or they using the device? When are you or they engaging with the device? Who are you or they engaging with through the device? And how are you or they engaging? So I give these questions and look at, and if everything's good, everything's good. But if there's something in there that you say, then it might be something to look at further. Here's my bibliography, and thank you very much.
And thank you so much, Dr. Grant. Let's go ahead and move into the education technology area. I'm going to introduce Dr. Justin Reich. Dr. Reich is an associate professor of digital media in comparative media studies at MIT. You've probably heard of that. And he's also the director of the Teaching Systems Lab. So I'm very interested in what his thoughts are about educational technology in 2022 in the classroom.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Brian. Did I unmute myself correctly and everything? You guys can hear me? Great. So I first of all, I'm sure almost everyone who's attending who has any connection to K-12 school systems at all has learned much more about education technology and online learning in the past 2 years than they ever expected. And I think there's two really important paradoxes to consider here. Schools are using education technology more than ever before, both to make the pivot to emergency remote learning work and as a follow-up to that emergency remote pivot. What were the kinds of technologies they adopted? Interestingly, for the most part, they did not adopt, what sort of education technologists would consider kind of the most cutting edge kinds of things. There are not a lot of students walking around with VR headsets on their heads or, interacting with artificial intelligence or other things like that. They actually adapted overwhelmingly two of our oldest and most well-established education technologies. So they're sort of the two foundational pieces of remote learning, of hybrid schooling. The first are learning management systems. These are things like Google Classroom, Schoology, Canvas. They were theorized in the 1960s and 1970s. They were commercialized in the 1990s. They were made open source in the 2000s. And they are really not that different from the folder that my elementary school daughter has in her backpack, where on one side it says to home and the other side it says to school. What learning management systems do is they help teachers and students pass documents back and forth to one another. They do some more things than that, but that's kind of their core functionality. The second technology, which has been essential to the pandemic, is the one that we're using right now. When it was introduced in the 1930s, it was called video telephony. We call it video conferencing now, but it's a technology that as a society, we have almost 100 years of experimentation and experience with. And for anyone who's ever taught over Zoom, you know that teaching through Zoom is a little bit like teaching through a keyhole. You can kind of see and hear what's happening on the other side, and the people on the other side can kind of see and hear you, but it's not really conducive to particularly meaningful conversation. And really interestingly, what educators primarily did with these two tools at great expense, with lots of effort, with many sleepless nights and long hours, is they reproduced existing practices of school systems in an online setting. They sort of created this kind of kabuki version of in-person school online with the same class periods and a lot of the same routines and the same kind of teaching and learning practices. So on the one hand, it was this kind of enormous effort. On the other hand, it ended up with a result that was in many ways profoundly conservative. So the sort of paradox of the pandemic is that we certainly see much more technology adoption, but it's not technology adoption which is transforming the experience of schooling for young people. It's technology adoption which reinforces the kinds of teaching and learning patterns that we already have in schools. For folks who are really hoping to transform schools through technology, this is certainly kind of a disappointment. But as someone who's just trying to figure out like what's going on in schools and what can we do to help them next, you know, the first thing to recognize is that most technology adoptions in schools are pretty conservative. They help schools do the same kinds of teaching and learning things that they were doing before, maybe at a distance, maybe with a little bit more efficiency, those kinds of things. I mean, a second really interesting paradox of the experience of the pandemic is that there's all kinds of things about schools that we all believed were fixed, immovable, permanent, had to be the way they are. And what we found is that there's actually lots of parts of schooling and educational systems that are contingent and flexible and plastic and can be changed. If we don't like the direction that schools are going in, if we don't like the ways technology is being used or the amount it's being used or how it's being applied, we now in some ways, you know, teachers, educators deep in their bones, they know in a new kind of way that things can change. That education force is also world historically exhausted. If you have talked to teachers or talked to school leaders in the last year, many folks will tell you that this year is an even harder year than last year. There's so many challenges afoot and ahead. And so there's this other paradox, which is on the one hand, we really know that if we need to, we can make schools change to work in different ways for young people. At the same time, there's not a lot of energy for revolution and rebellion and so forth. So I think these sort of paradoxes between new tools and conservative approaches, between possibilities of change and our exhaustion across the system, those are some of the features that are going to shape the use of education technology in our schools in the years to come. Ultimately, the most important questions about education technology are not what are the new tools that we're going to build, what's the new tech that we're going to have, what's the capacity. The most important questions we're going to ask are, to what extent can we build capacity for educators to be able to use the tools we have for better teaching and learning? Our technology is only as powerful as the communities that guide their use. That will be the sort of determining feature in the years ahead about whether or not all the new exposure that teachers and students have to education technology actually ends up leading to measurable gains in the future.
Great, thank you very much. Let's move now to Afua Bruce, who will, excuse me, tell you a little bit about how to leverage technology for both positive and negative social impact. So to tackle this, we have the right person because Ms. Bruce is a leading public interest technologist who has spent her career working at the intersection of technology, policy, and society. Her career, she's been in the government. She's also been in the nonprofit world, in private and academic sectors, and she has held senior science and technology positions at places like DataKind, the White House, the FBI, and IBM. So with that, Afua Bruce.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here today talking about one of my favorite topics. Last week, the federal government rolled out a website that allowed people to request rapid COVID tests. The website, it was delivered a day early and with a smooth user experience. It was a simple yet effective example of how policy or how we make systemic change in society is tied to technology. Without that technology, without a website working, which admittedly is not the experience several people have with government websites and government technology, but without that website working, we found that the technology that complemented and worked with the policy, it would have been difficult for the federal government to uphold its commitment to provide rapid COVID tests to any household that wants them in the US. Also, last year, DataKind, one of my former organizations, updated a data science model it had developed for an organization in Haiti. The nonprofit organization that DataKind partnered with, their mission was to provide access to dignified sanitation. And DataKind was called in to help deliver toilets quickly. By partnering with the organization on the ground and using some strong technical expertise, DataKind was able to develop a model that helped this organization make its deliveries much more efficiently and effectively. In fact, it decreased fuel costs by about 13%. So what do both of these examples have in common? Well, they're part of this this field broadly known as public interest technology, which is essentially looking at how we apply a technology perspective to problems in the public interest. How do we feed hungry people? How do we house the homeless? How do we use social media to include and not exclude? These are all challenges that when we take a look at them, not just as a social or just as a technical problem, but we take the interdisciplinary approach that public interest technology encourages, we can make change. So as one of the speakers, previous speakers today touched on, there are currently a lot of civically active and civically minded youth today. Knowing how to engage in a technological world, though, can be challenging for these children. Social media, as the previous speaker stated, can be difficult to navigate, and helping children understand that there are other technological ways to address what they see in the world can excite and empower students to pursue STEM careers and explore new ways of using tech. Positively. The media too has a piece to play here. What types of stories do we tell about the agency children have to make a difference today? Or even how they should consider engaging with technology? Do we emphasize the destructive aspects of social media, or do we provide inspiration for problem solving? Children have an ability to combine tech and the public interest today. Take, for example, Tavish Sharma, a high school student in the greater Chicago area. As his local paper wrote, Tavish felt compelled to continue helping hungry people after leading a Libertyville community project that consisted of assembling, collecting, and distributing non-perishable food items and sandwiches at several local food pantries in Lake County. Tavish then took the initiative to learn how to code and ended up developing Solve Hunger, which is an app that connects food pantry volunteers to help families affected by local disasters. This app has now grown and is now available in a number of states, and so working with a number of food pantries and getting food directly to people who are facing food insecurity. Public interest technologists have a space in every sector because the products we use every day, products that dictate how we interact with the world, are in the public interest. The combination of skills that public interest technologists bring, including empathy and long-term perspective taking, evaluation of trade-offs with an ethical and legal framework, and consideration of societal implications, are available to children today. We must help children see and believe that they are critical to having technologies that recognize everyone, regardless of skin tone, and disseminate true and accurate information. I think this is possible, and I'm really excited to see ways that we continue to encourage children to really engage with technology positively and not negatively. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Serge Egelman, who is the research director of the Usable Security and Privacy Group at the International Computer Science Institute. Now, this is an independent research institute affiliated with UC Berkeley, and he also has an appointment in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences Department. He is also the Chief Technical Officer and co-founder of AppCensus Incorporated, which is a startup that performs on-demand privacy analysis of mobile apps for developers, regulators, and watchdog groups. So from all of that, you can hear that he is going to be a great expert with regard to privacy and security concerns that I know many of us have. Dr. Egelman, you're up.
Thanks for the introduction. So my research lies at the intersection of human behavior and online privacy and security. So I primarily look at how consumers interact with online systems and use them to make privacy and security decisions, but also how online systems that people use go about using their data and what they do with it. So this led to a lot of work over the past 10 years now to look at the mobile app ecosystem. So my research group has been building lots of tools that allow us to run different mobile apps to see what data they access and where they send it to a degree that really isn't available to many others. And so through that work, we decided a couple of years ago to start looking at kids apps. And the reason why we decided to look at kids apps is this is actually an area that's somewhat regulated in the US. So there doesn't exist a national privacy law that gives consumers rights across industries, with the exception of the Children Online Privacy Protection Act. Which protects data from children under 13. So if you're an online service and you're collecting data from children, you need to comply with COPPA. So we started looking at, and stepping back, one of the things that COPPA requires is that behavioral advertising, the type that powers the internet, where people are profiled, that parents are given the right to consent to the profiling that leads to that, and certain data uses are just plain prohibited. And so we decided to look at how well apps are complying with this. The law has been around for almost 25 years now. And so it should be pretty well established. And so we started looking at mobile apps and found that half the apps that we analyzed in the Google Play Store appeared to be violating the law one way or another. This led to lots of changes. The Play Store has imposed some new policies. Legislators have written angry letters, but things are still up in the air. There have been a couple new bills introduced, but it's not clear anything's going anywhere. So issues are rampant. And the question is why, and what does this actually mean for parents and children? So most of the issues that we find have to do with either access to data that shouldn't be collected from children. So for instance, fine-grained location data that allows you to identify a child's address. This requires parental consent before it's collected. But we found that there were a lot of apps that were collecting this from the get-go. As soon as you start the app, they collect the data and send it to advertisers. So most of this type of data is collected, as I mentioned, to power the free internet. So for free services, data is collected, which is used to infer your interests so that advertisers can then send you targeted ads. This happens for children as well. And, a question that I get is, well, what are the consequences of this? Well, there are actually a lot of consequences. So, in the most benign case, it's going to be used for, just targeted ads, but there are also a lot of extreme cases that we hear about. So some of the recipients, are certainly advertising networks, but others are just data brokers who are just building profiles of consumer data, and they don't really much care whether it comes from a child or an adult. What they care about is building, detailed profiles that they can then sell, en masse to the highest bidder. And so there are unknown, future consequences of this. And that's why, the original intent of the law was to give parents control over this data collection. What we found, more recently, as we've been doing follow-up research in this area, is that much of the time, it's because app developers themselves just don't really know what they're doing. Software, modern software development is complicated and requires the use of a lot of, third-party components. So much the same way that your car isn't, every part of your car isn't made by that car manufacturer. They use pre-built components to save themselves time and also to be able to scale quicker. And also, more common components means easier repairs down the road. Software engineering is much the same, where, an app developer who needs, say, advertising in their app, they're not going to go through the trouble of, finding, advertisers and, helping them create ad copy. Instead, they're just going to, hire a third party ad network and bundle, some components into the app so that they don't have to go to the trouble of doing all of this themselves. The problem with that is, all of these third-party components, the developer who's integrating them is ultimately responsible for them. But, they have an obligation to read the documentation to make sure that they're configured correctly. Many of the cases, these components have privacy settings where they need to be specially configured for use in children's apps, because by default, they will engage in, privacy violative behaviors that would trigger various laws. And so therefore configuration settings are necessary when they're in child-directed apps, or even in other settings. So increasingly these third-party components have special instructions on how to comply with GDPR for EU users or CCPA for California users. The problem is app developers, they just want to get their app available to the market so that they can make money, and they want as few impediments to doing that as possible. So they often don't read the documentation. So certainly in a small number of cases, there are third-party components that are doing outright malicious things, such that the app developer probably doesn't, legitimately doesn't know what their app is doing, what data it's collecting, and who it's sending it to. But in other cases, it's just because they didn't bother to read the documentation. And, so that's one stakeholder who's, kind of causing the problems, but there are a lot of other areas in the ecosystem where, different stakeholders could, do something, but don't. So, another stakeholder are the regulators. So under COPPA, the FTC is the primary agency charged with enforcing it. There's not a private right of action. You can't, as a consumer, sue a company under COPPA because they've collected data from your child in violation of the law. Instead, you have to get the FTC or the state attorney general to file suit. The FTC in 25 years of COPPA's existence brings about 1 to 2 cases a year. They're very knowledgeable and, they know what they're doing, but they don't have the resources to actually, bring the enforcement actions that are necessary. And so enforcement isn't really happening. And so then without enforcement, you're left with, well, there's the central markets, in this case, the Google Play Store, the Apple iOS Store. They serve as gatekeepers, and so could potentially, do some vetting, but they don't have any reason to do so because they don't really bear under, liability under the current legal frameworks. And, it's a cost for them to do auditing, and, it's the moderation problem, why disinformation spreads online. It's all the same, fixing this is a costly problem that requires, human judgments and can't really easily be automated. Or when you do automate it, mistakes are often made. And so, the markets aren't really doing it enough, even though they're petitioned to do so. And what's left is just consumers. And so, consumers are expected to vet the apps and the content that their children use, but aren't actually given the tools to do so. So, as I said, this has been a 10-year research project building the tools to understand this ecosystem. It's ridiculous to expect that the average parent is going to be able to do the same thing just to figure out whether a website or an app is, safe to use, or even whether it's just complying with, the basic legal standards that it's expected to comply with. And as a result, no one's really looking at that. And yeah, parents are left holding the bag. And so, to end this on a depressing note, I often get asked, what can parents do? And really the answer is not a whole lot. This is why there's a need for stronger enforcement efforts from regulators, but also more stringent laws in the U.S. So that parents aren't left with dealing with this and not given the tools to actually do so.
Well, that is a perfect introduction, because now we're going to hear from Dr. Simpkins, who is an expert in parenting and family dynamics and might be able to help us a little bit more with that question of what can parents and families do. Dr. Simpkins is a professor at the University of California, Irvine in the School of Education, where she researches positive youth development and the influence of families and organized activities on that development. And so let's hear what Dr. Simpkins has to say about what parents and families can do.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to Children's and Screens for inviting me today. I'm very excited to be here. I'm, as Brian mentioned, I'm over at UC Irvine in the School of Education, and two areas of my expertise are in parenting and organized after-school activities. I was asked by the organization to talk about both of these, which I have no chance of doing in 5 minutes or doing them justice. So I'm going to talk about some of the highlights that I've noticed in the literature over the last few years. I'm going to start with communities. And so one of the, the positive side of the sword we've been talking about is technology has helped youth with community building. And so for some youth where they're feeling isolated, for example, if an adolescent is interested in photography, they can use technology in so many ways to help deepen their interest, find others who are interested in the same thing, and create a community. And that is really critical for some groups. Dawn talked about this, say LGBTQ youth. If they're struggling to find people in their live community around them, then technology can help them get that sense of belonging and find a community that way. Also, technology has helped organizations, organized after school activities, museums, provide their resources to a wider audience. And so that has been outstanding for youth because it's allowed them to overcome some barriers, say transportation, cost, to engage in these enriching resources and examine, for example, potential jobs or careers that they might want to pursue. Now, that said, it's also highlighted, particularly during COVID, but it's highlighted the existing inequities in our society on who has the technology, who has the media literacy to use it effectively, and additional things such as internet bandwidth. So even though these resources are out there, it can be challenging to wade through everything and be able to access them. So that's something our society still has a bit of a ways to go. Now, when people hear what I do, I often get the question, what should I do as a parent? And so in this case with technology, our goal as parents, and I'm a parent of two, is to help protect our children, right? And also to help teach them to become critical consumers and make strong decisions. We have no idea which direction technology is going to go and how it's going to evolve over time. When I was an adolescent, I never would have imagined all the things that are going on right now. And so it's important to teach them not just how to use the current technology, but to make critical decisions so that when our children are on their own with peers in context without us, or as adults, that they're making critical decisions. Now, as parents, we do this all the time. We do this we help teach our children how to tie their shoes. We talk to them about how to ask a friend how to play. We advise them on how to deal with a conflict with a friend. We also buy them safety gear, right? We take off the training wheels off of the bike, right? When they are adequate enough at riding on two wheels. And for complex skills like driving, we drive with them, right? That we quiz them. When the weather is changing, we interpret how they should adjust their driving based on the conditions. And a lot of these behaviors are also helpful with considering children and technology. So what can you do as a parent? First and foremost is building that strong relationship, the warm, trusting relationship that also does have clear expectations. That having that strong foundation will help make all the other behaviors I'm going to talk about more effective. So first, talk with children and adolescents, right? And ask those open-ended questions. Many of the other panelists had examples of that, but have them show you the technology that they're using. Ask them, why are they using it? What are they getting out of it? Have they shared private information? What information have they shared? Do they know how they can secure it? And those types of questions can open the door to many enriching conversations. Co-engage with your child on these different forms of technology. I personally have learned a lot from my children about technology and things that have been very helpful. I also have learned a lot about them, right, by engaging in these games and other forms of technology with them. Teach and advise, right? So when children want to write an email to a teacher, how should they do that? How should they construct that email? If they want to post a picture, what advice would you give them about posting that picture? Interpreter, right? The parents are very important interpreters. So not only when they receive, say, a text from a friend and how should they interpret that text, but parents can also help youth consider, if they post this, how could that be interpreted by their peer group or by other people, right? And those are very important things to help walk them through and help teach them. Of course, modeling good technology behavior. So as an example, for parents to put down the phone or other technology when they're having dinner with kids, interacting with kids. Monitoring, so there are ways on your phone, for example, where parents can approve an app before the child downloads it on their phone. Setting rules on the time, the content. And then, of course, adapting. So with all parenting strategies, as youth develop and they become more autonomous, they become more skilled, parents adapt their strategies to help meet their current needs. And then finally, and you've sort of heard this before in some of the other presentations, don't forget that offline time, that there's a wealth of research on reading with kids, on playtime with kids, family dinner time, even if it's 5 minutes, makes a big difference. So just making sure that in addition to helping prepare them to engage with technology in safe and smart ways, but that you're also not sacrificing that in-person time.
Great, thank you so much. For our final presenter, we are going to have Nicholas Carr. Nicholas Carr is an acclaimed writer, and one of his books on this exact topic that you probably have seen is the Pulitzer-prize finalist, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. He's also a visiting professor of sociology at Williams and was the former executive editor of the Harvard Business Review. So with that background, Nicholas Carr is in a good spot to give us a broad overview, sort of closing us out for the day and just giving us a broad idea of how technology has changed and is changing our society.
Thanks very much, Brian. Excuse me. And thank you to Pam and to the Institute for inviting me to share some thoughts here with you during this very important event. As we've seen today, when we talk about the societal effects of digital technology, we're talking about a very, very broad landscape. And we've hit many areas across that landscape today. And of course, there are many more that we haven't had time to touch on. What I would like to do is suggest a broad framework that might help us kind of think about all of these issues and why they've kind of played out the way they have, which has often been quite surprising and not always in a good way. And that framework is what economists refer to as general purpose technologies, or GPTs. The vast majority of technologies and tools are not general purpose. You use them for one thing or for a couple of things. You don't use a screwdriver to hammer in a nail. You don't use a hammer to screw in a screw. And so when we look at GPTs, general purpose technologies, we see a very different form of technology. It's not used for one or a few purposes, but it can be used for basically an infinite number of purposes that's bounded only by human imagination. And there haven't been very many GPTs throughout history. And when they come along, they tend to upset society changed the rules, changed the landscape of society in many different ways. And three of the very big ones over the last few hundred years are the steam engine, which inaugurated the Industrial Revolution, changed the face of society. Electrification, only about 100 years ago, again, completely changed the face of society. And in our own time, the arrival of computers, digital computers. When we look at the thing about general purpose technologies is because they're so rare and so powerful, society has a very hard time figuring out how they're going to affect people and institutions and social relationships. And as a result, what we see over and over again is that the unintended consequences of a general purpose technology tend to be greater than the intended consequences. And some of those unintended consequences are beneficial, some are harmful, some are problematic. And I think we've seen all of those, certainly, when it comes to computers, and more recently, the internet and smartphones and social media and so forth. And what I would argue is that if you look at a lot of our expectations about digital technology, and certainly the kind of expectations that were set for us by Silicon Valley, by technologists, by big tech and so forth, and then you look at the reality of the situation we face today, not only are there unintended consequences, but many of the outcomes that we expected and hoped for actually are almost the opposite of what the real outcomes that we're now struggling with are. And so let me very briefly give a couple of examples of that. And I think each of these is quite important in kind of underpins many of the challenges society faces today. First is cognition. We all assumed when the internet came along that more information would make us more thoughtful, would make us more understanding, wiser, smarter, because after all, information is the raw material of thought, so the more the better, the more raw material. What we've discovered though is that actually the pure quantity of information when it comes to how we think is less important than how that information is presented to us, how we take it in. And what we see with digital technologies is that they tend to provide information in a kind of constant inundation, very fragmented, many overlapping types of information. And now that we use our phones to gather this information, all of that information is squeezed down literally to a very small place. So what's happened, rather than making us wiser and more thoughtful, is the technology has on balance made us more distracted, less able to think conceptually, less able to sustain our attention, to think contemplatively, and so forth. A second area is social relations. We thought that the internet and digital technology in general, by increasing our ability to communicate, would lead to better social understanding, more harmonious social relations. We'd all learn about each other and become more empathetic and get along. And here too, we see the effects are often exactly the opposite. We don't live in a world of greater social harmony today than we did before the internet came along. In fact, you could make an argument that what we've seen is fractiousness, polarization, an inability to compromise or even to get inside the heads of people who think differently from us. And here too, I think this comes from some things we know about human psychology, but conveniently ignored when we were very hopeful about the technology. Actually, when people have unlimited amounts of communication, they tend to confine themselves into subgroups or tribes with people who think the same way, and they become more and more antagonistic with other people. There have been a lot of psychological studies, for instance, that show that putting people close together does not necessarily bring them into harmony. It often leads to resentment, anger, conflict, and so forth. A third area is economics. When computers and personal computers in particular, and the internet and social media came along, we thought, okay, this is going to be a decentralizing force. We're all going to have the power of a networked computer dedicated to ourselves. This is going to give us greater voice, greater economic flexibility, and it's going to decentralize things and lead toward more equality in income, in opportunity, and so forth. And again, here too, we've seen instead of being this massive force of decentralization, it's actually led to even greater centralization of economic power, of wealth, of control over media and information, and so forth. And then the final area is politics. Here too, we assumed that this ability to communicate and gather information that the internet has provided us would lead us, as many said, to democratization, greater democratization in addition to decentralization. So we'd have a democratization of media, democratization of politics, more freedom, more ability to express ourselves. And here too, we see a much, much, much more complicated situation. And I think you could make an argument today, and we don't know yet how this is going to play out, but that the technology actually seems to encourage authoritarianism rather than democratization. This is going to be one of the major struggles that we face in the years ahead. Now, in pointing all of these unexpected and sometimes quite negative effects out, I don't mean to imply that there aren't also the benefits we expected. Those are there too. But in many cases, the harms have outweighed the goods. And I think that's because we failed to prepare ourselves for many of these things, because we allowed our natural enthusiasm for technology to kind of blind us to some of the problems, and because that enthusiasm was very much amplified by the kind of utopian rhetoric that has come out of Silicon Valley. So looking ahead, I think we need to take very important lessons from all this and realize that we need to be much more skeptical about technological developments, particularly very large ones. We have to think much more carefully about human nature and how technology amplifies the good and the bad, and doesn't simply make us better people. We're the same people. Our good qualities and our bad qualities are amplified. And only by taking this much more skeptical, much more careful approach to technology, one that realizes that it's not the technology itself that should tell us which way to go, but it's our own societal good, the common good, that we should follow. It's only when we begin to be much more aggressive in imposing society's wishes upon technology rather than vice versa that we'll be able to address some of the current problems we have and also prevent more problems of this nature in the future. So thank you very much.
Great, and thank you. And just to add one other example, your concept of, it's not necessarily what we expected reminds me of an essay that John Maynard Keynes wrote. He was an economist, and in the early 1900s, he tried to imagine what would happen 100 years from then, which is now. And it was an essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And if you get a chance to look at it, it's almost humorous. For example, he thought that by this point, technology would be so advanced that we would only be working 1 to 2 days a week. So when was the last time that was a week for you guys? So it makes a lot of sense, Nicholas. Thanks so much for your thoughts there. Speaking of what digital technologies can do to our brain, we have taken in a huge amount of information over the past hour and 21 minutes. Our brains are full. We have heard about the tech impact on health, and including addiction and addictive tech tendencies, the impact on social and civic engagement, democracy, of course, information, how we get information and how we understand it, privacy and security, education, how youth develop, and even society in general. This is huge, and it is just, in my mind, too much for a human being to process. So what I think would be really good to close us out just in the last few minutes is I'd like to ask each person to just give us one tidbit for that food pyramid that we were thinking of at the beginning. We were thinking to ourselves, we need a couple of guidelines. What's that one little tidbit that from your perspective would help folks? And so I'm really just looking for a few words here, not a whole other presentation, but just sort of a summarization. So what I would say, for example, for myself, and then I'll introduce in folks in order. So I'll have Dr. James give hers, and then of course we'll skip Congressman Raskin, but then we'll go right to Dr. Grant. What I would say for my little presentation on health is that the one key thing we need to do is realize the balance. If we realize that there's almost always another side, we will be able to think very carefully about each double-edged sword and we'll be able to do something about it. Dr. James, what do you think?
Thanks, Brian. So I don't want to repeat some of the things that other panelists have already said about things parents can do. I think a lot of the things that Sandy said already really overlap with advice I'd have for parents. I just want to bring one other perspective to bear, which is when we think about our children and when we think about young people, sometimes the most helpful help to them doesn't come from adults. It comes from their peers and other youth. And so teens can have amazing, teens are my focus, but they can have amazing advice for each other. And as adults, I think we can intentionally create spaces for them to exchange, discuss dilemmas of the sort that I talked about, and really recognize where they're already doing that, often on apps that are, spaces that are hidden from our line of sight.
Thank you. Dr. Grant, what is your one nugget that you would add?
What I tell parents, model the behavior. And also it's a good digital citizenship for all of us. Try to engage online and with the same behaviors as you would in real life, and you should be okay.
Sounds great. Dr. Reich.
Yeah, I would say our technologies are only as powerful as the communities that guide their use. And so in a lot of cases, the negative aspects or the positive aspects that we see of technology are reflections of the societies, the cultures, the context that they work in. And so if we're trying to have better, healthier relationships with technology, we should be thinking about, all right, well, that probably is not just the work of technology development. It's the work of organizing in politics and building a better society.
Agreed. Thank you. Ms. Bruce.
I would say that children are able to participate actively today in engaging in reframing how technology is used, to take it from some negative aspects to positive aspects. It's a matter of giving them the right inspiration and the right tools, and then letting them go forward from there. They're more than capable today of taking that active role in reshaping technology.
I think that's wonderful. Empowerment. It makes me think of the etymology of the word education, because it really comes from educare, the duke as in a duct in your house, right? It is so, and the E is X, out of. And so really education is not about shoving stuff in there. It's about bringing out that natural empowerment that so I apologize for a little bit of a detour there, but I completely agree. Dr. Egelman.
Yeah, I guess my bit of advice is don't despair if you don't understand all of the technologies that your kids are using, or how to, stay abreast of them. Very few people do. But what you should despair about is the fact that there aren't really any privacy laws that prevent the data from going places you don't want it to go and being used for things you don't want it to be used for. And that's something you can organize about and complain to your representatives, but also exercise the limited rights that you do have. If you live, in California, you can, exercise rights under CCPA to request copies of your data or your child's data, as well as opt out of these sales. And elsewhere, you should write your representatives about why you don't have those rights.
Super. Dr. Simpkins.
I would say for parents to show an interest and co-engage with their children through technology and offline, as well as to keep adapting based on child interest, child needs, and child skills.
Great. And bring us home, Nicholas Carr.
I would suggest we should ban smartphones from schools.
That's great. We have something very specific so that everyone can be chewing on it. Thank you all so much. Let me reintroduce our fearless leader, the creator, the engine behind Children and Screens and all of the good that it does, Pamela Hurst Della Pietra.
Well, thank you so much to Brian and our diverse panel of experts, Carrie, Don, Justin, Afua, Serge, Sandy, and Nick for being here today and for sharing really meaningful insights on this important and immense topic. Thanks also to Congressman Jamie Raskin for sharing your thoughts, even though you couldn't be here with us today. We appreciate all of you who tuned in from home or work, and we hope you found it as interesting as I did. We hope to see you again at a future webinar or another event. When you leave the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. Please take a moment to share your thoughts on this webinar and any ideas you may have for future topics. In the coming weeks, we'll publish on our website a compilation of reflections and essays from even more experts and thought leaders at www.childrenandscreens.com, which will include and address many of the specific questions you've submitted today. In the meantime, be sure to review the numerous helpful resources available on our website. A recording of today's webinar will be posted to our YouTube channel in the coming days. We encourage you to subscribe and watch our previous webinars, and we hope that you'll share our resources with your family and friends, as well as your fellow parents, educators, clinicians, and researchers. For more from Children's Screens, please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn at the accounts shown on your screen. Join us on Wednesday, February 9th, as we host the first of 3 age and stage focused webinars and tackle the questions most frequently asked about early digital media use and its impacts on babies, infants, and toddlers. Thanks again for being here. Everyone, be safe and well.